And none of the motorcycle clubs in the United States or globally are as respected and feared as the notorious Hells Angels. However, referring to them merely as a motorcycle club can be misleading. The general public often labels them a biker gang, while law enforcement may classify them as an organized criminal enterprise. It would be an exaggeration to claim that every member of the Angels is a hardened criminal. Many likely enjoy riding their bikes, socializing at the clubhouse, and drinking beer. Nonetheless, it's reasonable to conclude that those looking to join the club should be prepared for some, shall we say, unlawful activities. Hells Angels chapters worldwide have been the focus of numerous investigations into organized crime, encompassing activities like drug trafficking, arms smuggling, and extortion. Many members have faced charges ranging from minor offenses to serious crimes. The cases we will examine today belong to the latter category, and a word of caution. Some of these offenses are truly horrific, with many victims being among the most vulnerable in society. Please proceed with care. The murder of Cynthia Garcia. In October 2001, members of the Mesa, Arizona chapter of the Hells Angels committed a horrifying crime over a trivial matter: the perceived disrespect shown by Cynthia Garcia, a 45-year-old woman who had been brought to the clubhouse by a prospect, someone hoping to gain membership in the club. According to Angels of Death, Inside the Bikers' Global Crime Empire by William Marsden and Julian Scher, Hells Angels members Kevin Augustiniak and Paul Eichscheid, who was a former stockbroker, became violent with Garcia when she refused to engage in a sexual act. When she continued to argue, the bikers beat her unconscious. Augustiniak and Eichscheid, along with another member who later turned informant, placed Garcia in the trunk of a car, drove her to the desert, and brutally murdered her by stabbing and partially decapitating her. Augustiniak was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 23 years in prison, while Eichscheid, who had fled but was extradited from Argentina in 2018, received a 19-year sentence for his role. The informant, Michael Kramer, provided critical testimony, aiding authorities in taking down over 30 Hells Angels members across 5 states on various charges. The Arvada Colorado shootout. In the summer of 2020, Jake's Roadhouse, a bar in the Denver area neighborhood of Arvada, Colorado, became the scene of a violent clash between Hells Angels members and their rivals, the Mongols biker gang. The confrontation in the parking lot quickly escalated, spilling into nearby streets. Gunfire erupted, motorcycles sped away, and fistfights broke out. By the time it was over, 43-year-old Hells Angel William Henderson had been fatally shot. 2 of his friends were hospitalized with multiple gunshot wounds. 2 uninvolved bystanders were injured after being forced off the road by fleeing bikers, and another individual was critically injured while trying to intervene in a fight. The man who attempted to stop the fight was Ryan McPherson, lead singer of the classic rock band Nightwolf. According to his bandmate, Jay Halpern, McPherson stepped in when he saw someone being beaten with a motorcycle helmet. Unfortunately, the attackers turned the weapon on him, leaving McPherson with a traumatic brain injury. 7 months later, 10 individuals had been arrested as part of the investigation, while McPherson continued to recover from the life-altering injuries he sustained during the attack. A triple murder in Massachusetts. David Glasser spent his final years living in constant fear of Adam Lee Hall, the Sergeant-at-Arms of the Hells Angels Berkshire, Massachusetts chapter. Glasser was a potential witness in an assault case against Hall, and over the years, he endured threats, intimidation, and physical attacks from the biker. As revealed during Hall's murder trial, the harassment culminated in Glasser's abduction and murder, along with 2 others who were unfortunate enough to be with him at the time. In 2011, Hall, along with 2 accomplices, Caius Viovis, who aspired to join the Hells Angels, and David Shalhoub, a member of the Aryan Brotherhood, kidnapped Glasser, his roommate Edward Frampton, and their friend Robert Chadwell from Frampton's home. The 3 were taken to a secret location, where they were shot and dismembered with a circular saw. The criminals were eventually brought to justice after another Aryan Brotherhood member, who had met Shalhoub in prison, testified against them. All 3 were convicted of the murders in 2014. During sentencing, District Attorney David Capeless urged the judge to impose the maximum penalty, describing the killings as brutal, hateful assaults on 3 defenseless men, via the Berkshire Eagle. The judge agreed, sentencing Hall to 3 consecutive life. The brutal killing of Mary Kay Harmer in Nebraska. It took more than a decade for Thomas Nesbitt to be held accountable for the 1975 murder of 19-year-old Mary Kay Harmer in Nebraska, who tragically crossed paths with the Hells Angel. Harmer had been a high school friend of Kathleen Ray, who lived with Nesbitt. On November 30th, Ray invited Harmer and her roommate, Gayla Jorgensen, to what she described as a housewarming party. However, the event was far from that. Nesbitt was already at the house, and shortly after the women arrived, Ray and Jorgensen left, leaving Harmer alone with him. Although the details remain unclear, court documents revealed that Nesbitt later confessed to Ray and his neighbor, Wayne Bieber, that he had messed up by allegedly sexually assaulting Harmer. Fearing she might report him, Nesbitt, after consulting with Ray, decided to kill her. Bieber later testified that he burned Harmer's clothes, and the trio wrapped her body in a carpet before dumping it in a utility hole at an unfinished housing development. 9 years later, her skeletal remains were discovered, and forensic experts determined that Nesbitt had unsuccessfully tried to dissolve her body with lye before disposing of it. Nesbitt was convicted of her murder in 1986 and sentenced to life in prison. A tragic case of mistaken identity. In February 1988, David Hartlaub, a music store manager in Sandusky, Ohio, was found dead beside his van, shot after arriving at a bank to make his nightly deposit. Although it initially appeared to be a robbery, police soon realized the cash deposit bag was untouched. With the help of witnesses, investigators uncovered that the men responsible were part of the local Hells Angels chapter. Their motive, however, was based on a tragic error. The men had intended to target a member of the rival outlaw gang in retaliation for a previous shooting. Unfortunately, they mistook Hartlaub, who drove a van similar to the intended targets, for the rival biker. Hartlaub was attacked inside his van and shot with a 9mm pistol, with one of the attackers suffering a ricochet wound that left blood evidence, which led to their conviction. Wayne Yee, Mark Verdi, and John Ray Bonds were all found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and firearm offenses. Their appeal was later rejected. A quadruple murder so brutal. Even the angels turned informant. The horrific quadruple murder in 1977 in Gaston, Oregon, might have remained unsolved if not for its extreme savagery. The crime, involving the cold-blooded killing of young children, was so appalling that even hardened criminals and members of the Hells Angels broke their code of silence to provide information. In August of that year, 24-year-old Margot Compton was murdered as retribution for testifying in a pimping trial against Otis Garrett, a former president of the Vallejo, California chapter of the Hells Angels. Compton had previously worked for Garrett as a prostitute. The killing was carried out by Robert McClure, an associate of the Hells Angels, on Garrett's orders. Before murdering Compton, McClure forced her to witness the execution of her 19-year-old friend, Gary Sessler, and her 6-year-old twin daughters. McClure and Garrett weren't convicted of the murders until the mid-1990s, thanks to the testimony of fellow inmates, including some Hells Angels, who had heard McClure boast about the crime while he was serving time for other offenses. Both men received 4 consecutive life sentences, one for each of their innocent victims. A killer lived free for years. As recounted in Angels of Death, inside the bikers' global crime empire, the Hells Angels quickly earned a reputation for violence after establishing themselves in England in 1969. In 1984, David Richards, a member of the Nomads chapter, was sentenced to life in prison for the gruesome murder of 16-year-old Michael Groves. At his girlfriend's home, Richards stabbed Groves over 50 times and scrawled "Hells Angels" on the wall with the boy's blood. Despite his life sentence, Richards escaped prison in 2005 and evaded capture for almost a decade. Living under a false identity, Richards collected disability benefits, traveled, and lived a seemingly normal life. When he was finally caught in 2014, Groves' family expressed outrage, believing the police hadn't put enough effort into finding him and attributing his capture to media coverage rather than police work. Derbyshire Assistant Chief Constable Carl Smetham acknowledged that authorities had incorrectly assumed Richards would be hiding in London and promised improvements to their procedures for tracking escapees. The murders of Maureen and Telesforo Bautista. Being in a relationship with a Hells Angel can pose serious risks, and for Maureen Bautista, it proved to be deadly. Court documents reveal that her boyfriend, Robert Garceau, a member of the Hells Angels, was involved in methamphetamine production, and their relationship was tumultuous. In the summer of 1984, Garceau became paranoid, suspecting Bautista might disclose his whereabouts to Eddie Nash, a drug dealer to whom Garceau owed money, and who had a reputation for heavy cocaine use. In September, his suspicions escalated, leading him to stab Bautista to death in her apartment with her 14-year-old son. Garceau then attacked the boy as well. He disposed of the bodies by hiding them in a dresser, which was then covered with freshly poured concrete. Despite the absence of physical evidence linking Garceau to the murders, he carelessly boasted about the crime, seemingly unaware that even fellow criminals disapprove of harming children. Some of his accomplices later testified against him at his 1985 trial, where he was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Garceau died of cancer on death row in 2004 at the age of 58. The Grandalski family massacre. Among the most brutal acts in Hells Angels history was the massacre perpetrated by Gerald Lester and Charles Diaz, both members of the Vallejo chapter. According to Angels of Death, inside the bikers' global crime empire in 1986, William Grandalski was expelled from the Vallejo chapter under unclear circumstances. Authorities later discovered he might have maintained contact with Terry Dalton, a disgraced former member, and could have been dealing drugs within the club's territory. In October 1986, Lester and Diaz visited Grandalski's home. An argument broke out, during which Lester shot Grandalski in the face with a 9mm pistol. To eliminate any witnesses, he then shot Patty and Jeremy. Diaz, whom Dallas referred to as Uncle Chuck, attacked the young girl with a knife, but when he complained about the time it was taking, Lester shot her as well. The two then set the house on fire in an attempt to destroy evidence, but they left enough behind to lead investigators to them, and both were ultimately sentenced to life in prison. Murder just for fun. While many innocent people have been brutalized simply for being associated with those targeted by the Hells Angels, others have suffered similar fates due to unfortunate circumstances. Such was the tragic case of Kevin Thorpe and Laura Craig, a young couple who, in 1981, made the fatal error of stopping for gas at a convenience store where Hells Angel Benjamin Psycho Silva and his friends, Joseph Shelton and Norman Thomas, were present. The trio was interested in Craig, and after the couple left, they followed them. Using a dashboard light, they tricked Thorpe into pulling over, and the nightmare began. Silva and Thomas forced their way into the car, while Shelton followed in his vehicle, and they drove the couple to a remote cabin owned by Shelton. They tied Thorpe to a tree, leaving him outside in the cold overnight, while they repeatedly sexually assaulted Craig. Finally, Silva and Shelton untied Thorpe only to take him to a hilltop, where they took turns shooting him with an assault rifle, emptying the 30-round magazine. Afterward, they drove Craig a short distance up the road, forced her out of the car, and shot her dead. Silva and Shelton were eventually tried and sentenced to life in prison, while Thomas, who testified against them, received an 11-year sentence. The killing of Bradley Parkhurst. Bradley Parkhurst was just a man considering buying a motorcycle when he was at the wrong house and greeted the resident inappropriately. In February 1972, Parkhurst and his friend, Clyde Burke, visited the home of Connie Perry, who was dating a man close to two Hells Angels members, Russell Bea and Marvin Gilbert. Perry led the pair to the basement, where Gilbert worked on a motorcycle frame. Upon introduction, Gilbert made a disparaging remark about Parkhurst's handshake, using a racial slur. Offended, Parkhurst confronted Gilbert, and a fight ensued. Perry quickly fetched Bea, who arrived and pinned Burke against the wall. Meanwhile, Gilbert brutally assaulted Parkhurst, beating and stomping him until he was near death and pleading for mercy. Eventually, Gilbert and Bea stopped the assault and left, leaving the others to try to help Parkhurst. When he began to fade, they attempted to revive him by injecting him with methamphetamines, which caused him to convulse. After 3.5 hours, Parkhurst died. Despite the attempts of his caretakers to claim he had overdosed, the state of his body indicated the truth. Gilbert and Bea were tried together and found guilty of second-degree murder. The East Village Assault, 1971. In 1971, New York City was a cultural and social upheaval center, a vibrant fusion of various communities and lifestyles. Yet, beneath the lively arts and emerging countercultures, a grim reality persisted: the violent realm of outlaw motorcycle gangs. At the forefront of this brutal subculture were the Hells Angels, a notorious group infamous for their aggression and strict code of silence. The disturbing events that unfolded during a funeral for a fallen Hells Angel in the East Village starkly illustrated their readiness to utilize violence to maintain their dominance. The funeral, intended as a solemn tribute, descended into chaos when 8 gang members recognized Eugene Pritzert, a local leather shop owner. Having previously crossed paths with the Hells Angels, Pritzert unwittingly became their target on that fateful day. The gang encircled him and launched a savage attack that left him injured and bloodied. This assault triggered a chain of events, leading to an unspeakable act of horror. As Pritzert was being assaulted, a 17-year-old female friend from California inadvertently walked into the mayhem. Her arrival escalated the violence significantly. Instead of retreating, the gang intensified their brutality, dragging her to a nearby location where they held her for 6 grueling hours. During this period, she was subjected to sexual assault, further emphasizing the gang's brutality and utter disregard for human life. This horrific incident served as a stark reminder of how violence could spiral uncontrollably within gang culture. The repercussions of the East Village assault extended far beyond the immediate terror of the event. It sent shockwaves through the local community, fostering fear and framing the Hells Angels not merely as a motorcycle club, but as a gang capable of extreme violence against anyone who opposed them. This incident marked a critical shift in public and law enforcement perceptions of the Hells Angels, exposing their lengths to assert control and instill fear, even among innocent bystanders. This act of brutality became a defining moment in the legacy of violence that would characterize the Hells Angels for years to come. The murder of Cynthia Garcia, 2001. Fast forward 3 decades to the early 2000s, the Hells Angels' history of violence remained as potent as ever, as evidenced by the shocking murder of Cynthia Garcia in 2001. This heinous crime, perpetrated by Kevin Augustiniak and Paul Eichide of the Mesa, Arizona chapter, stunned both law enforcement and the local community. After a party, the 2 men assaulted Garcia when she rejected their advances, a response that underscored the toxic masculinity and violent attitudes prevalent in biker culture. The brutality of the assault escalated rapidly, culminating in the horrifying act of forcing Garcia into the trunk of their car. They drove her to a secluded location, away from the visibility of passers-by. There, they viciously stabbed her to death, an act marked by the gruesome detail of partially decapitating her body. The senselessness of this crime appalled even the most seasoned investigators, who had encountered numerous violent cases before. This level of brutality was particularly shocking. Ultimately, Augustiniak received a 23-year prison sentence, while Eichide was sentenced to 19 years. However, the ramifications of their actions reached far beyond their prison terms. Cynthia Garcia became a symbol of the threats posed by outlaw motorcycle gangs, targeting not just their enemies, but also innocent individuals who happened to be caught in the crossfire of gang violence. This crime served as a stark reminder of the deep-rooted culture of violence within the Hells Angels. This culture not only exploited the vulnerable, but also suppressed dissent through brutality. The murder of Michael Groves, 1984. The cycle of violence continued through the 1980s, culminating in one of the most atrocious murders linked to the Hells Angels: the killing of 16-year-old Michael Groves in 1984. This crime, carried out by David Richards, a member of the Hells Angels Nomads chapter, exemplified the extremes of violence the gang was prepared to employ to assert its dominance and instill fear in the community. Richards' assault on Groves was horrifying. He stabbed the teenager over 50 times, reflecting not only his rage, but a disturbing display of power and control. Following the murder, Richards went so far as to scribble "Hells Angels" on the wall with Groves' blood, a grotesque act that marked the scene and underscored the gang's involvement in the crime. The brutality of this incident sent shockwaves through the community, fostering lingering fear and outrage. Richards was sentenced to life imprisonment, but in an ironic twist that seemed almost typical within the violent narrative surrounding the Hells Angels, he escaped in 2005, living under a false identity until his capture nearly a decade later. The Jake's Roadhouse Bar Shootout, 2020. In recent years, the cycle of violence has shown no signs of ceasing. The 2020 shootout at Jake's Roadhouse Bar in Colorado exemplified the continual gang warfare characterizing the Hells Angels and their rival gangs, particularly the Mongols. This violent clash erupted during an event at the bar, highlighting that the hostility between these outlaw motorcycle clubs was far from settled. The gunfight spilled into the streets, resulting in the tragic death of 43-year-old Hells Angel William Henderson, along with injuries to multiple bystanders, including rock band lead singer Ryan McPherson, who attempted to intervene. This incident demonstrated that the violence associated with the Hells Angels and similar gangs extends far beyond their circles, often affecting innocent people caught in the crossfire. Witnesses described scenes of panic as gunfire erupted, shattering the peacefulness of the evening and serving as a stark reminder of the persistent threat posed by gang violence. The Jake's Roadhouse incident reflected a brutal reality. The gang culture, driven by rivalry and the desire for dominance, continues to pose significant dangers to public safety. It served as a modern reflection of the horrors witnessed decades earlier, reinforcing the notion that the legacy of violence associated with the Hells Angels is not merely a relic of the past, but a continuing narrative that warrants attention and action from law enforcement and society as a whole, be it from the bone-breaking beatings or the appalling killing. These acts show how some people in this infamous motorcycle club act in their quest for dominance. While many members might just be out for the ride, some individuals have given Hells Angels a bad name, stretching across the whole motorcycle culture continuum. In attempting to comprehend these crimes, it is important to comprehend the intricacies of the culture of bikers, as well as the enduring battle between the police and organized crime. Upon such contemplations, it is worthwhile to understand that there are people who suffer, and their families and their communities are also irrevocably traumatized as a result of such brutality. Thank you for being with us on this ride as we discuss one of the worst times in the motorcycle club's history.